Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the stone-cold reality of medieval night barracks, where sleeping through the night wasn't just about rest, it was about surviving until dawn. Picture yourself lying on a straw mattress in a castle dormitory, your breath visible in the air above your face, frost actually forming on the inside walls of your sleeping chamber. The temperature inside isn't much warmer than the courtyard outside, and you're sharing this Arctic nightmare with a dozen other armed men who smell like leather, sweat, and desperation. You probably won't survive this if you're thinking of medieval knights as pampered nobles lounging in luxury. These weren't silk-sheeted bedrooms with roaring fireplaces. These were survival bunkers carved from stone where the architecture itself seemed designed to kill you slowly through hypothermia. The walls radiated cold like they were made of ice, and the narrow windows, when they existed at all, offered no protection from howling winds that found every crack and crevice. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how this content travels across time zones while we all settle in together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The medieval night barracks wasn't a single room concept, it was more like a fortress within a fortress. Stone corridors connected sleeping chambers that housed anywhere from 8 to 20 men depending on the castle's size and the garrison's needs. These weren't private quarters. Privacy was a luxury that could literally freeze you to death. The stone walls, sometimes 3 feet thick, were magnificent for stopping arrows and siege engines, but they also trapped cold air like a tomb. You'd enter these sleeping chambers through heavy wooden doors that never quite fit their frames properly, allowing drafts to whistle through constantly. The floors were typically flagstone, which meant they absorbed and held cold like a massive ice block. Some barracks had rushes scattered across the floor, dried grasses and herbs that provided minimal insulation, but mostly just gave fleas and mice places to hide. The ceiling height varied wildly. Some chambers soared 15 feet high, which looked impressive but created vast volumes of cold air that your body heat could never warm. Others were cramped barely 8 feet high, which actually worked better for warmth retention, but felt like sleeping in a cave. Either way, you were dealing with architecture that prioritized military function over human comfort. Knights didn't choose their sleeping spots randomly. There was a hierarchy even in suffering. Senior knights claimed positions nearest to whatever heating source existed, usually a small brazier or the occasional fireplace. Younger knights and squires found themselves relegated to the coldest corners, farthest from warmth, closest to the worst drafts. This wasn't cruelty. It was practical survival politics. The curious thing about these barracks is how they revealed the gap between fantasy and reality. Chronicles described these same rooms during feasts and celebrations as magnificent halls and noble chambers. But strip away the tapestries hung for special occasions, remove the extra braziers brought in for important guests, and you're left with what the knights actually lived with: stone boxes that challenged human endurance every single night. Historians still argue whether the discomfort was intentional military conditioning or simply the result of medieval building limitations. Some suggest that sleeping in harsh conditions toughened knights for campaign life, where they'd face even worse circumstances. Others argue that castle builders simply hadn't figured out how to make large stone structures habitable during winter months. You wake up in a medieval knight's barracks, and the first thing you notice isn't the sound of morning bells or the clatter of armour being donned. It's the frost. Actual ice crystals have formed on the inside of the shutters overnight, and when you breathe out, your exhalation creates a small cloud that hangs in the air like a ghost. This isn't some dramatic exaggeration for effect. This was documented reality in countless castle records and personal letters from the medieval period. The stone walls around you aren't just cold. They're actively hostile to human warmth. Limestone, sandstone, and granite all have one thing in common: they're thermal vampires. They suck heat from the air and hold on to cold like they're being paid to do it. Touch the wall beside your sleeping pallet and it feels like pressing your palm against the side of a frozen lake. Medieval masons knew how to build walls that could withstand trebuchets and catapults, but they had no concept of thermal insulation. Here's where it gets really fun. The mortar between stones contracted in cold weather, creating hairline cracks that turned your sleeping chamber into a wind tunnel. These weren't gentle breezes. These were focused jets of Arctic air that found their way to whatever part of your body was trying to stay warm. Chronicles from northern European castles describe knights waking to find their washing basins frozen solid with ice, thick enough that servants had to break it with hammers. The windows, when they existed, were basically rectangular holes in the wall covered with wooden shutters that fit about as well as a medieval dentist's smile. Oiled parchment or thin scraped animal hide sometimes covered these openings, but these materials became brittle in extreme cold and often cracked, letting in even more frigid air. Glass windows were so rare and expensive that they were considered treasure, and even then they provided no insulation, just a transparent barrier that still radiated cold. But here's a detail that might surprise you. Some castle chambers actually had internal frost formations that knights considered almost beautiful. Ice would form intricate patterns on the walls overnight, creating crystalline artwork that disappeared when touched by candlelight. A few surviving letters from French knights describe waking to see their breath freeze and fall like snow onto their blankets. They wrote about it with a mixture of awe and resignation, as if witnessing natural magic that happened to be slowly killing them. The ceiling beams presented their own special torture. Wooden rafters contracted in the cold, creating gaps that allowed frigid air from upper levels to pour down onto sleeping men. Some knights learned to position their pallets to avoid these cold waterfalls, but in crowded barracks avoiding one meant accepting another. Metal fixtures, brackets, hinges, door handles became so cold they could actually freeze skin on contact, leading to a medieval version of the tongue-on-flagpole phenomenon. The floor situation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of all. Stone floors absorbed cold from the earth below and held it like a massive battery. Even with rushes, straw, or the occasional rug, the cold seeped upward relentlessly. Knights learned to test the floor temperature with their hands before stepping barefoot because stone cold enough could cause immediate frostbite on unprotected feet. Historians still argue whether castle builders were simply ignorant of thermal comfort, or whether harsh living conditions were considered character building for warriors. Contemporary accounts suggest that some lords actually took pride in their castle's harsh conditions, viewing survival through winter as proof of their knight's worthiness. A tough castle produced tough men, or so the thinking went. The most sobering detail. Many castle chambers included small alcoves called warming niches, spaces carved into walls, where knights could huddle with heated stones or small braziers. The fact that these architectural features were considered necessary tells you everything about how fundamentally hostile these sleeping spaces were to human life. You weren't just going to bed. You were entering a survival scenario that repeated every single night. You might think knights simply stripped down and jumped into bed after a long day of training or guard duty, but that assumption would literally kill you in a medieval barracks. The art of undressing for sleep was actually a calculated survival strategy, a delicate balance between maintaining enough warmth to live through the night while staying ready for emergency mobilization if the castle came under attack. Picture yourself as a knight preparing for bed. You don't remove your armor all at once, that would be suicide in both tactical and thermal terms. Instead, you follow a practice sequence that every experienced knight learned through trial error and watching comrades who got it wrong suffer the consequences. First, you remove the heaviest pieces, the plate armor, chainmail, hauberk, and metal gauntlets. These items are not only heavy, but they conduct cold like frozen lightning rods, turning your body heat into an express lane for hypothermia. But here's where it gets interesting. Knights often kept their padded gambeson on that thick quilted undergarment that served as cushioning under armour. This wasn't just comfort, it was insulation technology. The gambeson was essentially a medieval sleeping bag worn as clothing, stuffed with wool linen, or even hair that created air pockets for heat retention. Smart knights had learned that this single piece of gear could mean the difference between shivering discomfort and actual survival. The leg protection presented its own puzzle. Removing heavy leg armour was essential for circulation, but knights often kept their wool hose or linen brace on under additional layers. Some even slept in their leather boots, reasoning that frozen feet in the morning were worse than slightly uncomfortable sleep. Medieval medical texts warned about foot rot from excessive cold, and knights had seen enough blackened toes to take this seriously. Here's a detail that might make you laugh. Knights often kept their weapons within arm's reach, not just for security, but because metal weapons left outside the sleeping area would become painfully cold to handle. A sword hilt that had been sitting in a frozen chamber all night could literally burn skin when grabbed suddenly. Experienced knights learned to wrap weapon handles in cloth or keep smaller weapons like daggers inside their bedding to maintain workable temperatures. The head covering strategy was particularly crucial. Knights understood that massive amounts of body heat escaped through the scalp, so most slept with woolen caps, coifs, or even their mail coifs if they were expecting trouble. Some wrapped their heads in spare cloaks, creating hood-like arrangements that trapped warm air around their faces and necks. This wasn't vanity. Medieval medical knowledge correctly identified heat loss through the head as a major factor in freezing deaths. Belt and sword arrangements required special consideration. A knight had to be able to arm himself quickly if needed, but sleeping with the sword belt on was uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. Many developed personal systems hanging weapons on nearby wall pegs at specific angles, or wrapping sword belts round bedposts in patterns that allowed quick access. Some castles even had standardized weapon racks positioned between sleeping pallets for this exact purpose. The underwear situation, if we can call it that, was surprisingly sophisticated. Wealthy knights owned multiple layers of linen undergarments, and they'd often sleep in the cleanest, driest layer, while the day's sweat-soaked clothing aired out nearby. This wasn't just hygiene wet clothing next to skin in freezing temperatures, it was essentially a death sentence. Poor knights who couldn't afford multiple layers faced brutal choices between staying clean and staying warm. Historians still argue whether knights actually slept combat-ready, or whether chronicles exaggerated their preparedness for dramatic effect. Archaeological evidence from castle excavations suggests that most barracks had dedicated armour storage areas, implying that full disarmament was normal. However, personal accounts from siege situations describe knights sleeping fully armed for weeks at a time, suggesting that the undressing ritual varied dramatically based on circumstances. Your sleeping surface as a medieval knight wasn't exactly what you'd call a mattress in any modern sense. Picture a thick canvas sack stuffed with straw chaff, dried grasses, and whatever organic material happened to be available during the last harvest. This contraption was your bed, your insulation, and quite often your ecosystem, because you definitely weren't sleeping alone even when you thought you were. The straw mattress served multiple purposes beyond just giving you something softer than stone to lie on. Fresh straw actually provided decent insulation properties, trapping air between the stalks and creating a barrier between your body and the frozen floor. But here's the catch. Fresh straw was expensive and needed to be replaced regularly. Most knights slept on straw that had been in use for months, sometimes seasons, becoming compressed, musty, and home to an entire civilization of unwanted guests. Fleas were the most obvious inhabitants of these medieval mattresses. These weren't just a few random bugs, we're talking about established colonies that treated your sleeping area as their personal kingdom. Medieval chronicles rarely mentioned flea infestations because they were so universally accepted as part of life. Knights developed a tolerance for constant itching and biting that would drive modern people absolutely insane. Some even considered flea bites a minor price for the warmth that came from shared sleeping arrangements. But fleas were just the beginning. Lice established themselves in the fabric and straw, creating a secondary population that specialized in hair and clothing. Bedbugs found their way into the seams and crevices emerging at night to feed on sleeping knights. Mice built nests in the straw, and occasionally rats joined the party. The rustling sounds that accompanied every movement weren't just shifting straw, they were the sounds of an entire ecosystem disturbed by your attempts to find a comfortable position. Here's where it gets strategically interesting. Knights often shared mattresses not just for warmth, but because multiple occupants actually helped control the vermin population. More body heat meant less attractive conditions for some parasites, and the constant movement of several sleeping men disrupted insect breeding cycles. A mattress with 3 or 4 knights on it was often less infested than one occupied by a single sleeper. The stuffing materials varied depending on the castle's resources and location. Coastal fortresses sometimes used dried seaweed, which provided good insulation but created a distinctive oceanic smell that never quite left the fabric. Mountain castles might stuff mattresses with pine needles and moss, which had natural pest-repelling properties but could be scratchy and aromatic. Some wealthy establishments used down feathers, but these were luxury items reserved for the highest-ranking knights or visiting nobility. Maintenance of these mattresses was a constant battle. Servants would periodically empty them, wash the canvas sacks and refill them with fresh materials. But in winter, when fresh straw was precious, and washing facilities were limited, mattresses often went months without proper cleaning. The smell became legendary, a mixture of human sweat animal materials, organic decay, and whatever the local vermin population was contributing to the mix. The practical arrangement of multiple nights on these mattresses required its own etiquette. Sleeping positions were often assigned based on rank, with senior knights claiming the centre spots where they'd benefit from heat from both sides. Edge positions were colder, but offered more movement freedom. Knights learned to coordinate their movements to avoid disturbing the entire group when one person needed to adjust position or leave for night duties. Historians still argue whether the shared mattress system was primarily about warmth conservation or simply about making efficient use of limited space and materials. Archaeological evidence from castle excavations shows that barracks were designed with specific spacing for these shared sleeping arrangements, suggesting that the practice was architectural rather than accidental. What's certain is that privacy and personal space were luxuries that could literally cost you your life in a freezing castle dormitory. You slide onto that flea-infested mattress, and immediately you understand why medieval knights developed what we might call the human furnace strategy. This wasn't about personal space or individual comfort. This was about creating a collective heating system using nothing but human bodies pressed together in calculated arrangements that meant the difference between surviving the night and becoming a cautionary tale. The positioning wasn't random or casual. Knights arranged themselves according to a hierarchy of heat generation that took into account body size, metabolism, and social rank. The largest, most robust knights typically claimed the center positions where they could radiate heat outward to their smaller companions. Think of it like arranging logs in a fire. You put the biggest pieces in the middle, where they burn longest and hottest, with smaller kindling arranged around them to catch and spread the warmth. But here's where the strategy gets sophisticated. Knights learn to sleep in alternating positions, head to foot to maximize heat distribution, while minimizing the awkwardness of face-to-face sleeping. This arrangement meant that each person's core body heat warmed another person's extremities, creating a circulation system where everyone's survival depended on everyone else's warmth generation. It was communism by necessity, capitalism by morning. The breathing patterns of multiple sleepers actually created a microclimate under the shared blankets. Each exhale added warm, humid air to the shared space, while the collective body heat gradually warmed the air trapped in their makeshift tent. Medieval knights discovered through experience what modern science confirms: a group of people can raise the temperature in an enclosed space by several crucial degrees just through their combined presence. Timing was everything in these sleeping arrangements. Knights couldn't just pile onto the mattress whenever they felt tired. They coordinated their bedtime to maximize the collective warming effect, with the group settling down together to build heat simultaneously. Late arrivals disrupted the thermal ecosystem by introducing cold air and cold bodies into an environment that was just beginning to reach survivable temperatures. The courtesy rules were fascinating and practical. No one moved unnecessarily once the group warmth was established. Sudden movements introduced cold air pockets and disturbed everyone's carefully positioned limbs. Knights developed subtle communication methods, gentle touches, quiet whispers to coordinate position changes when absolutely necessary. Rolling over became a group activity that required consideration for your sleeping partners. Different castle garrisons developed their own sleeping traditions. Some rotated sleeping positions nightly, ensuring that everyone got turns in the warmer centre spots. Others maintained strict hierarchy, where rank determined permanent sleeping position. A few progressive commanders instituted a system where the coldest sleepers from the previous night earned priority positioning the next evening. Here's a detail that reveals how seriously they took this survival strategy. Knights who were known to generate less body heat, whether due to illness, injury, or just natural physiology, were sometimes assigned extra clothing or given heated stones to bring to bed. The group's survival depended on everyone contributing to the collective warmth, so individual thermal deficiencies became everyone's problem. The morning ritual was as coordinated as the evening arrangement. Knights learned to wake gradually, allowing their bodies to adjust to the temperature change before exposing themselves to the full Arctic assault of the chamber air. They'd often stay pressed together for several minutes after waking, building courage for the brutal moment when they'd have to leave their human heating system and face the frozen world outside their blankets. Some garrison records describe knights who became so dependent on shared sleeping arrangements that they literally couldn't sleep alone when circumstances required it. These men would lie awake shivering in solitary assignments, their bodies having adapted to expect the warmth of companions. It was a form of thermal codependency that revealed just how marginal survival really was in these stone fortresses. Historians still argue whether this communal sleeping system strengthened military bonds or simply reflected desperate survival necessity. What's clear from personal accounts is that knights who survived multiple winters together developed relationships forged by shared vulnerability that lasted throughout their military careers. Now here's where medieval survival strategy gets genuinely clever and slightly aromatic. Knights didn't just tolerate dogs in their sleeping quarters, they actively recruited them as four-legged heating systems. We're not talking about cute lapdogs here. These were massive hunting hounds, war dogs, and mastiffs that could weigh as much as a grown man and generate heat like furry furnaces that happened to have teeth and questionable hygiene habits. Picture yourself settling down for the night when a 100-pound mastiff decides your legs are the perfect place to curl up. Initially, you might protest the dog smells like wet leather old meat, and whatever unfortunate thing it rolled in during the day. But within minutes, you're experiencing warmth that no amount of blankets could provide. The dog's normal body temperature runs several degrees higher than yours, and unlike human companions, it maintains consistent heat output all night long without tossing, turning, or stealing covers. The tactical placement of dogs became an art form among experienced knights. Smaller hounds were positioned at feet and lower legs where circulation was poorest and frostbite most likely. Larger dogs claimed positions along torsos and backs, providing broad surface heating for core body areas. The most prized sleeping companions were the great wolfhounds and mastiffs that could stretch alongside a full-grown knight, essentially becoming a living blanket that breathed generated heat and occasionally growled at suspicious noises. Here's what makes this strategy brilliant. Dogs naturally seek warmth, just like humans do, so they were motivated participants in the arrangement. A cold dog pressed against a warm night benefited both parties. The animals would actively burrow under blankets, position themselves in the warmest spots, and even adjust their positions throughout the night to maintain optimal heat distribution. It was a symbiotic relationship where survival instincts aligned perfectly. Different breeds offered different advantages. Mastiffs provided maximum heat output, but took up enormous space, and occasionally forgot their strength when stretching or repositioning. Greyhounds and similar hunting dogs were smaller, but generated surprising amounts of warmth relative to their size. Plus they were more agile in crowded sleeping arrangements. Sheepdogs brought their own insulation in the form of thick coats that trapped warm air around both dog and human. The hierarchical aspects extended to dog placement too. Senior knights claimed the rights to the largest, warmest dogs, while junior knights and squires made do with smaller hounds, or even had to share dog privileges. Some castle records mention disputes over particularly effective heating dogs, with knights actually negotiating trades of duties or favours in exchange for access to the warmest canine companions. But this wasn't just about heat, it was about early warning systems too. Dogs sleeping in the barracks provided security alerts for approaching threats. unusual sounds or changes in the castle's routine. A dog that suddenly lifted its head or growled quietly could alert sleeping knights to potential dangers before human senses detected anything. This dual-purpose arrangement made the animals invaluable beyond their heating capabilities. The downside, of course, was legendary. Medieval dogs weren't exactly pristine. They brought fleas, ticks, and other parasites into an already challenging environment. They shed constantly, adding hair to air that was already thick with straw dust and human respiration. They occasionally had digestive incidents that required middle-of-the-night clean-up efforts, and they dreamed sometimes violently with sudden movements and vocalizations that could wake an entire barracks. Chronicles from Scottish castles describe a practice where particularly valuable heating dogs were actually assigned to specific knights, with the care and feeding of these animals becoming part of military duties. Some knights developed such strong bonds with their sleeping companions that they'd request the same dogs for campaign deployments, viewing them as essential equipment rather than mere pets. Historians still argue whether the health benefits of dog-generated warmth outweighed the hygiene risks of sharing sleeping space with animals. Medieval medical knowledge understood that staying warm prevented illness, but they hadn't connected animal-borne diseases to human health problems. What's certain is that knights who slept with dogs consistently reported better sleep quality and fewer cases of severe frostbite during harsh winters. The responsibility for keeping fire alive through the night wasn't just another chore, it was literally a matter of life and death that required the kind of precision and dedication usually reserved for religious rituals. You'd be assigned fire duty on a rotating basis, and everyone understood that falling asleep on your watch could mean waking up to find your fellow knights blue-lipped and hypothermic if they woke up at all. Fire duty began hours before the official bedtime. As the designated firekeeper, you'd start by banking the main hearth fires throughout the castle, a process that involved carefully arranging logs and coals to burn slowly and steadily, rather than blazing hot and fast. This wasn't simply throwing wood on flames, it was engineering a controlled burn that would last 6 to 8 hours without consuming so much fuel that you'd run out before dawn. The braziers in the sleeping chambers required even more delicate handling. These portable metal fire bowls were your primary weapons against the Arctic assault of stone walls and winter air. You'd fill them with a mixture of charcoal, dried hardwood, and sometimes even dried animal dung, anything that burned long and steady rather than bright and brief. The goal was consistent heat output, not impressive flames that would die out in 2 hours and leave everyone frozen. Here's where the job gets technical. You had to understand airflow patterns in each chamber. Stone rooms created complex air currents that could either feed your fires or starve them of oxygen. Experienced firekeepers learned to position braziers where drafts would provide enough air to keep coals glowing, without creating wind tunnels that would steal heat from sleeping knights. It was medieval HVAC engineering using nothing but observation and trial and error experience. The fuel management aspect required serious planning. Dry wood was precious during winter months, and you couldn't just raid the supply whenever you felt like it. Each night's fire duty came with a specific allocation of fuel, so many logs, so much charcoal, so many bundles of kindling. Running out before dawn meant either letting fires die or making unauthorized raids on tomorrow's fuel supply, both of which could result in serious disciplinary action. Night rounds were the most critical part of the job. Every hour or two you'd make a circuit of all the fires under your care, checking fuel levels, adjusting airflow and adding materials as needed. This required moving through dark, freezing corridors carrying embers or small flames to relight fires that had burned too low. One dropped ember could start a catastrophic blaze. One neglected brazier could mean frozen nights by morning. The social pressure was intense. Knights sleeping around your fires trusted you with their lives in the most literal sense. If you screwed up, people suffered. Some firekeepers developed almost obsessive vigilance, checking fires more frequently than necessary, because the consequences of failure were so severe. Others treated it like any other duty until they experienced their first night of watching fellow knights shiver uncontrollably, because the fires had died. Different castles developed different fire duty traditions. Some rotated the responsibility daily among all knights, ensuring everyone understood the importance and difficulty of the task. Others assigned it to specific individuals who showed aptitude for fire management and fuel conservation. A few used it as punishment duty for knights who had violated regulations or performed poorly in training. Here's a detail that shows how seriously they took this. Many castles maintained emergency fuel reserves specifically for night fire duty. These stockpiles were guarded as carefully as weapons or food supplies, because running out of heating fuel during a harsh winter could devastate morale and fighting effectiveness. Firekeepers who consistently managed to stretch their fuel allocations through entire nights were valued almost as much as skilled weapon masters. The morning assessment was always tense. When the day watch arrived to relieve you, they'd evaluate how well the fires had been maintained through the night. Knights who had slept warm and comfortable were appreciative. Those who had suffered through cold hours were not. Your reputation for reliability and competence could rise or fall based on how effectively you'd managed the thermal environment through the dark hours. Historians still argue whether fire duty was considered an honour or a burden among medieval knights. Personal accounts suggest it varied by individual temperament and castle culture, but what's consistent is the recognition that firekeepers held genuine power over their comrades' comfort and survival during the harshest months of the year. Before you even think about crawling under those flea-infested blankets, you'd participate in one of medieval warfare's most ingenious heating technologies, the heated stone system. This wasn't some primitive camping trick. This was sophisticated thermal engineering that could mean the difference between sleeping through the night and waking up with blackened fingers and toes that would never quite work the same way again. The process began hours before bedtime, usually around the evening meal. Large stones, typically smooth river rocks, or specially carved pieces of dense limestone, were placed directly into the hearth fires, or arranged around the edges of cooking fires in the castle kitchen. These weren't random pebbles. They were carefully selected stones that could absorb and hold massive amounts of heat without cracking under thermal stress. Some castles maintained dedicated collections of bedstones that were sized and shaped specifically for this purpose. Size mattered enormously in stone selection. Too small, and the stone would cool off within an hour, leaving you with a useless lump taking up valuable space in your bedding. Too large, and you'd risk serious burns from stones that stayed dangerously hot for too long. The ideal bedstone was roughly the size of a man's head, heavy enough to retain heat for 4 to 6 hours, but manageable enough to transport safely and position carefully in bedding arrangements. Here's where the technique gets sophisticated. Knights learned to use multiple stones of different sizes to create thermal zones in their sleeping areas. Large stones went near the centre of the bed to provide core heating. Medium stones were positioned at foot level where circulation was poorest, and smaller stones could be tucked against specific body parts that were most vulnerable to frostbite necks, wrists, ankles, and lower backs. The handling and transport process required serious skill and equipment. Hot stones fresh from the fire could easily reach temperatures that would cause instant severe burns. Knights used specially designed iron tongs, thick leather wraps, and wooden carriers to move heated stones from fires to sleeping areas. The journey from hearth to bed was often a two-person operation, with one knight handling the transport equipment and another clearing the path and preparing the bedding to receive the hot cargo. Wrapping techniques were crucial for both safety and heat retention. Stones were typically enclosed in thick wool cloth, multiple layers of linen, or specially designed leather pouches that provided insulation between the burning hot rock and human skin while allowing controlled heat transfer. Some knights owned personal stone wrapping materials that they guarded as carefully as their weapons, understanding that proper insulation could extend a stone's useful heating time by hours. The positioning strategy required careful planning. Stones placed too close to your body could cause burns during sleep when you unconsciously rolled against them. Stones placed too far away provided no warming benefit at all. Experienced knights learned to create heat fields around their sleeping positions, with stones arranged to warm the airspace rather than making direct contact with skin. This took practice and often painful trial and error learning. Different stone types offered varying performance characteristics. Dense granite held heat longest, but was heaviest to transport and position. Sandstone heated quickly, but also cooled relatively fast. Limestone provided good heat retention and was easier to shape into convenient sizes. Some coastal castles experimented with heated metal objects, iron bars or bronze plates, but these were dangerous because metal could stay burning hot much longer than stone, and cause severe burns even through thick wrapping. The cooling timeline created its own strategic considerations. A properly heated stone would provide significant warmth for the first 2 hours, moderate heating for the next 2 hours, and gentle residual warmth for another hour or two beyond that. Knights learned to coordinate their stone heating with their sleep schedules, timing the process so that maximum heat coincided with the coldest parts of the night, typically the hours just before dawn. Shared stone arrangements in group sleeping situations required negotiation and cooperation. Knights had to coordinate heating times, transport duties, and positioning to ensure that everyone benefited from the collective thermal strategy. Some groups developed rotation systems where different knights took responsibility for stone preparation on different nights, sharing both the work and the warming benefits. Historians still argue whether heated stone technology was widespread throughout medieval Europe or limited to particularly harsh climates and well-equipped castles. Archaeological evidence suggests that specialized stone heating tools were common enough to indicate regular use, but personal accounts describing the practice are relatively rare, possibly because such basic survival techniques weren't considered worth documenting. Your cloak wasn't just clothing, it was survival technology that could be deployed in dozens of different configurations depending on wind direction, available heat sources, and how many other warm bodies you could recruit to share your thermal fortress. Think of it as medieval engineering meets origami, where the difference between a properly wrapped cloak and a carelessly thrown blanket could literally determine whether you'd wake up with all your fingers still functional. The basic cloak construction was already designed with survival in mind. These weren't fashion statements. They were life support systems made from tightly woven wool that had been treated with lanolin to repel moisture while maintaining insulation properties. The best cloaks were so densely woven that they could actually block wind while trapping warm air, creating a microclimate around your body. that your metabolism could actually warm to survivable temperatures. The wrapping technique started with understanding your body's heat loss patterns. Knights learned through cold experience that heat escaped most rapidly from the head, neck, wrists, and ankles areas where blood vessels ran close to the skin surface. The first wrap always secured these critical points, with the cloak pulled up to cover the back of the neck and then arranged to seal around the wrists and lower legs. This wasn't comfort. This was thermal triage protecting the most vulnerable areas first. Layering strategies varied depending on what materials were available. A knight with multiple cloaks could create an insulation system with outer windbreaking layers and inner heat-trapping layers. But most knights owned only one good cloak, which meant mastering the art of single cloak configuration for maximum effectiveness. This involved precise folding techniques that created air pockets while eliminating gaps where warm air could escape or cold air could infiltrate. The foot wrapping method was particularly crucial and complex. Feet were the most likely body parts to suffer serious frostbite, partly because they were farthest from your heart's heat generation, and partly because cold stone floors sucked warmth out of them relentlessly. Knights learned to use the bottom portion of their cloaks to create insulated foot cocoons, wrapping and tucking fabric in patterns that sealed around ankles while providing cushioning against the frozen floor. Here's where the technique gets really sophisticated. Experienced knights understood wind patterns within castle chambers and positioned their cloak arrangements to work with or against air currents. A cloak arranged to catch and redirect a small draft could actually help circulate warm air around your body. The same cloak positioned incorrectly could channel cold air directly against your skin, turning a mild draft into a freezing assault that would keep you awake all night. Group cloak engineering was an advanced survival strategy for shared sleeping arrangements. Multiple knights could link their cloaks together, creating larger thermal environments that benefited everyone. This required coordination and trust. You were literally tying your survival gear to other people's gear, and if someone moved carelessly or had to leave for night duties, they could disrupt everyone's carefully constructed warmth systems. The morning unwrapping ritual was almost as important as the evening wrapping process. Cloaks that had been wound tightly around bodies all night would be damp with condensation from breath and body heat. This moisture needed to be aired out during the day, or the fabric would lose its insulation properties and potentially freeze during the next night's use. Knights learned to time their morning routines to allow for proper cloak drying, without leaving themselves exposed to cold air longer than necessary. Different regions developed distinct cloak wrapping traditions based on local climate and available materials. Scottish knights mastered techniques for dealing with persistent dampness that could freeze into deadly ice shells. Nordic castle garrisons developed ultra-tight wrapping methods for extreme cold that could literally save lives in temperatures that would kill exposed humans. Mediterranean knights focused more on wind-blocking arrangements since their winters were milder, but often included brutal drafts. The social aspects of cloak sharing revealed interesting hierarchies and relationships. Sharing cloak space was an intimate survival arrangement that required trust and cooperation. Senior knights could command access to the warmest cloak arrangements, but they also took responsibility for protecting younger knights, who might not survive the night without shared warmth. Some knight partnerships developed around compatible cloak wrapping styles and coordinated heat retention strategies. Historians still argue whether the elaborate cloak wrapping techniques described in surviving accounts were practical necessity, or whether medieval writers exaggerated the complexity for dramatic effect, What's clear from archaeological evidence is that medieval cloaks were substantially heavier and more robustly constructed than later garments, suggesting they were indeed designed to serve as portable survival shelters rather than simple clothing. Picture yourself holding a wooden cup filled with steaming ale that's been heated with a red-hot iron rod, the liquid so warm it actually hurts your fingers through the wood, and you're about to discover why medieval knights considered this burning throat scorcher to be essential survival equipment, rather than just an evening beverage. This wasn't recreational drinking, this was internal heating technology that could raise your core body temperature enough to survive the night ahead. The preparation of hot ale was a precise science that castle brewers and kitchen staff mastered through necessity. Regular ale was warmed using fire-heated iron rods, metal pokers, or hot stones that were plunged directly into the liquid. The goal was to achieve a temperature just below scalding hot enough to provide genuine internal warming, but not so hot that it would burn your mouth and throat on the way down. Getting this balance right required experience and careful temperature testing. But here's where it gets interesting from a survival perspective. Hot ale wasn't just about the immediate warming sensation. The alcohol content caused vasodilation, temporarily expanding blood vessels, and improving circulation to extremities that were most vulnerable to frostbite. Knights could actually feel warmth spreading through their fingers and toes within minutes of drinking heated ale, a physiological effect that could prevent serious cold injuries during the night. The herbs and spices added to winter ale served both flavouring and medicinal purposes. Ginger, cinnamon, cloves and nutmeg weren't just taste enhancers, they were warming spices that medieval medical knowledge correctly identified as circulation boosters. Some castle ale preparations included honey, which provided additional calories for heat generation, and medicinal herbs like feverfew or elderflower that were believed to prevent winter illnesses. The timing of ale consumption required strategic thinking. Drink too early in the evening and the warming effects would wear off before the coldest hours of the night. Drink too late and the liquid would interfere with sleep, or require inconvenient middle-of-the-night trips to relieve yourself in freezing conditions. Experienced knights learned to time their hot ale consumption to coincide with their bedtime preparations, maximizing the internal warming just as they settled into their sleeping arrangements. Different social ranks had access to different quality ale preparations. Wealthy knights enjoyed ale heated with expensive spices and served in metal cups that retained heat longer. Common soldiers made do with basic heated ale served in wooden or clay vessels that cooled quickly. But even the simplest hot ale provided genuine survival benefits, democratizing at least one effective warming strategy across all levels of castle hierarchy. The communal aspects of evening ale consumption served social and practical purposes beyond individual warming. Groups of knights sharing hot ale around braziers or hearths created shared warming sessions where body heat, fire heat, and internal alcohol heat combined to raise everyone's core temperature before sleep. These gatherings also served as informal briefings where night duty assignments were discussed and security concerns were shared. Here's a detail that reveals how seriously they took this survival strategy. Many castles maintained dedicated ale heating equipment specifically for winter use. Special iron rods with wooden handles, metal cups designed to retain heat, and even portable braziers for heating ale in sleeping chambers. This equipment was considered essential gear maintained and guarded as carefully as weapons or armour. The brewing modifications for winter ale were substantial. Castle brewers would increase alcohol content during cold months, understanding that stronger ale provided better warming effects. They'd also adjust fermentation processes to create thicker, more caloric beverages that provided longer-lasting internal heat generation. Some winter ales were so thick and nutritious, they functioned almost like liquid meals rather than simple drinks. Regional variations in hot ale preparation reflected local climate challenges and available ingredients. Northern European castles developed ales with higher alcohol content and more aggressive warming spices. Coastal fortresses experimented with seaweed and kelp additives that were believed to provide additional nutrition and warming properties. Mountain castles focused on calorie-dense preparations with honey nuts and dried fruits. The morning-after considerations were real and practical. Knights who had consumed significant amounts of hot ale the night before needed time to recover their alertness and coordination before assuming duties. Some castle schedules actually accommodated this reality, with ale-heavy evening routines, followed by slightly delayed morning activities. The survival benefits were considered worth the temporary reduction in morning sharpness. Historians still argue whether the medical benefits of hot ale consumption were genuine, or whether medieval knights simply enjoyed having a socially acceptable excuse for evening drinking. Modern research confirms that moderate alcohol consumption does improve circulation and provide temporary warming effects, suggesting that medieval survival instincts were scientifically sound, even if the understanding wasn't complete. Now comes the moment when all your survival preparations converge into a single critical technique that separates the knights who wake up alive from those who become cautionary tales whispered around morning fires. You pull those heavy wool blankets over your head and suddenly you're not just sleeping, you're engineering a personal atmospheric system using nothing but your own breath, body heat, and whatever fabric you can gather around yourself. The breathing tent method sounds simple until you actually try to execute it properly in a stone chamber, where the ambient temperature is hovering somewhere between meat locker and early grave. You create a sealed or semi-sealed space under your blankets, where your exhaled breath can accumulate and gradually warm the air you're breathing back in. But here's the tricky part: too much sealing, and you'll suffocate yourself with carbon dioxide. Too little sealing and all your warm air escapes, leaving you breathing frozen air that feels like swallowing ice crystals. The fabric positioning requires precise engineering that knights learn through trial and often painful error. You need to create an air pocket around your head and upper torso that's large enough to contain several breaths worth of air, but small enough that your body heat can actually warm the space. This means arranging blankets, cloaks, and any available fabric in a dome-like configuration that traps warm air while allowing just enough ventilation to prevent suffocation. Your breathing technique becomes crucial for maintaining the system throughout the night. Slow, controlled breathing produces warm, humid air that gradually heats your personal atmosphere without creating the rapid air exchange that would waste your thermal efforts. Knights learn to breathe deeply and steadily, almost meditatively, understanding that their respiratory rhythm directly affected their survival chances. Panic breathing or irregular patterns would disrupt the delicate thermal balance they'd worked so hard to create. The moisture management aspect was both helpful and problematic. Your warm breath naturally contains water vapor that would condense on the inside surfaces of your fabric tent, creating a thin layer of moisture that could either provide additional insulation or freeze into ice depending on outside temperatures. Experienced knights learned to position their breathing tent so that condensation would collect in areas where it wouldn't drip back onto their faces or freeze against their skin. Here's where the technique gets sophisticated. Knights developed personal variations based on their individual physiology and available materials. Larger knights could create bigger air pockets that took more time to warm but provided more breathing space and comfort. Smaller knights focused on minimal air volumes that heated quickly but required more precise positioning to maintain adequate oxygen flow. Some knights even learned to coordinate their breathing patterns with sleeping partners to share the warming benefits. The layering strategy for breathing tents involved understanding how different fabrics behaved in cold, humid conditions. Wool maintained its insulation properties even when damp, making it ideal for the inner layers closest to your breathing space. Linen or cotton outer layers could provide additional sealing while remaining breathable enough to prevent dangerous carbon dioxide buildup. Some knights even used leather pieces as breathing tent components, understanding that properly treated leather could provide excellent wind-blocking properties. The timing of tent creation was critical for maximum effectiveness. Starting the breathing tent process too early meant wasting time and energy warming air before you were ready to sleep. Starting too late meant trying to warm your personal atmosphere when you were already cold and potentially hypothermic. Knights learned to coordinate breathing tent deployment with their other warming strategies, heated stones, hot ale consumption, and group sleeping arrangements. Different sleeping positions required different breathing tent configurations. Knights sleeping on their backs could create larger, more stable air pockets, but had to be careful about fabric positioning to prevent suffocation. Side sleepers developed techniques for maintaining thermal airspaces while accommodating the natural movement that occurred during sleep. Some knights even learned to maintain modified breathing tents while sleeping in sitting positions during siege conditions or when space was extremely limited. The emergency protocols for breathing tent failures were essential knowledge. If your fabric configuration collapsed or became displaced during the night, you needed to be able to quickly re-establish your thermal environment without fully exposing yourself to the chamber's frigid air. This required keeping spare fabric within reach and knowing how to rebuild your personal atmosphere by feel in complete darkness. Historians still argue whether the breathing tent method was widespread knowledge among medieval knights, or whether it was specialized survival information passed down through specific military units and regional traditions. Personal accounts that describe the technique are relatively rare, possibly because such basic survival methods weren't considered worth detailed documentation, or because the knowledge was considered trade secrets among experienced warriors. The brutal truth about medieval castle sleeping arrangements was that your position in the military hierarchy literally determined how close you came to freezing to death each night. This wasn't metaphorical. Your rank dictated your physical distance from life-saving heat sources, and that distance could mean the difference between waking up with full mobility in your fingers or spending the morning trying to restore circulation to blackened extremities. Picture the sleeping chamber layout like a thermal map where warmth was currency and social status was your credit rating. The senior knight, usually a man who'd earned his position through years of service combat experience or noble birth, claimed the sleeping spot closest to whatever heating source existed. The brazier, the small fireplace, or even just the chamber's least drafty corner. This wasn't arbitrary privilege. This was survival economics where experience and authority translated directly into better odds of living through winter. The positioning hierarchy extended outward from the heat source in concentric circles of decreasing warmth and increasing desperation. The second-ranking knight secured a spot close enough to benefit from radiant heat, but far enough away to avoid accidentally displacing his superior. third and fourth ranking knights negotiated for positions that balance proximity to warmth with respect for established social boundaries. Everyone understood that challenging these arrangements could result in both social punishment and literal death by freezing. Squires and junior knights found themselves relegated to the thermal wasteland, the coldest corners, the spots most exposed to drafts, the areas where stone walls radiated cold like malevolent ice spirits. But here's where the system revealed both its cruelty and its hidden mercy. Experienced senior knights understood that dead subordinates served no military purpose, so they often shared warmth through indirect means, extra blankets, access to heated stones, or even permission to position themselves closer to heat sources during the coldest hours. The earning of thermal privileges was a complex social dance that went far beyond simple rank. Knights who demonstrated exceptional loyalty, particular skills, or valuable service could find themselves granted better sleeping positions as rewards. A knight who'd performed well during combat training showed unusual competence with weapons maintenance, or demonstrated reliability during night watch duties might earn a spot closer to the fire. This created powerful incentives where improved performance directly translated to improved survival odds. Here's where the politics get interesting. Thermal privilege could also be used as punishment. A knight who'd violated regulations, shown cowardice, or disrespected superiors might find himself exiled to the coldest sleeping positions as discipline. This wasn't just discomfort. This was genuine physical punishment that could result in frostbite illness or worse. The threat of thermal exile was often more effective than traditional military punishments because it directly threatened survival. Different castle garrisons developed varying approaches to thermal hierarchy management. Some maintained rigid systems based purely on military rank, with positions assigned according to official status, and never changing regardless of circumstances. Others implemented more fluid arrangements, where thermal privileges could be earned, lost, or traded based on performance and behaviour. A few progressive commanders rotated thermal positions, ensuring that everyone experienced both the best and worst sleeping spots over time. The negotiation and trading aspects of thermal positioning revealed fascinating social dynamics. Knights would sometimes trade duties, share equipment, or provide services in exchange for access to warmer sleeping spots. A knight skilled at armour maintenance might trade his services for a knight closer to the brazier. Another might share his heated stones or extra blankets in exchange for future thermal considerations. These arrangements created informal economies where warmth was literally exchanged for labour and loyalty. Emergency protocols existed for situations where the thermal hierarchy broke down. During siege conditions, extreme weather, or when heating fuel ran dangerously low, some castles implemented survival protocols where thermal positioning was assigned, purely based on physical vulnerability rather than social rank. Sick knights, injured men, or those showing signs of hypothermia might be granted emergency access to the warmest positions regardless of their normal status. The seasonal variations in thermal hierarchy were significant. During milder weather, the positioning mattered less, and social arrangements could be more relaxed. But as winter deepened and castle temperatures dropped to life-threatening levels, the thermal hierarchy became rigid and potentially deadly. Knights who'd enjoyed casual arrangements during autumn found themselves fighting for survival positions when the real cold arrived. Regional differences in thermal hierarchy reflected local climate challenges and cultural traditions. Northern European castles often maintained stricter thermal positioning systems because survival margins were smaller. Southern regions might have more flexible arrangements because winter conditions were less immediately lethal. Coastal fortresses developed systems accounting for the additional challenges of humidity and wind that could make moderate temperatures feel much more dangerous. Historians still argue whether thermal hierarchy was an intentional system of social control or simply an inevitable result of limited heating resources and military rank structures. What's clear from surviving accounts is that knights were acutely aware of these arrangements, and that thermal positioning was considered a significant aspect of castle life during winter months. When the physical strategies fail and your body starts betraying you with uncontrollable shivering, when the heated stones have gone cold and the dog has wandered off to find a warmer human, you discover that survival in a medieval barracks becomes as much a mental battle as a physical one. Knights developed psychological techniques that were part warrior discipline, part folk wisdom, and part desperate self-hypnosis designed to help their minds endure what their bodies couldn't comfortably survive. The mental preparation began hours before bedtime with what modern psychology might recognize as cognitive conditioning. Knights would deliberately focus their thoughts on warm memories, summer campaigns, fires from home, the heat of forge work, or even the burning sensation of sword work that left muscles warm and blood flowing. This wasn't just daydreaming. This was systematic mental training designed to convince the brain that warmth was still possible even when physical evidence suggested otherwise. Breathing techniques served dual purposes as both thermal management and meditation. The slow, controlled breathing necessary for maintaining a breathing tent under blankets also functioned as a form of medieval mindfulness practice. Knights learned to focus entirely on the rhythm of inhalation and exhalation, using the breathing pattern as an anchor for consciousness that could help them endure hours of physical discomfort without panic or despair. Prayer and recitation provided mental frameworks that could occupy consciousness during the long, cold hours when sleep seemed impossible. Knights would recite familiar prayers, repeat military oaths, or mentally rehearse weapon techniques and battle strategies. This served multiple purposes. It kept the mind occupied with familiar content, provided a sense of purpose and identity, even in miserable circumstances, and created mental rhythms that could help induce sleep despite physical discomfort. The visualization techniques were surprisingly sophisticated for their era. Knights learned to imagine themselves in warm environments, sitting by massive hearths, working in sunny fields, or even experiencing the heat of combat where adrenaline and exertion created internal warming. Some developed elaborate fantasy scenarios they could return to, night after night, mental refuges where their consciousness could retreat while their bodies endured the harsh reality of stone chambers and winter air. Here's where folk beliefs and practical psychology intersected. Many knights developed personal rituals and superstitions that provided psychological comfort, even when they had no physical warming effect. Touching a particular amulet, whispering specific phrases, or arranging personal items in precise patterns created a sense of control and agency in situations where they were otherwise powerless against the cold. These rituals didn't generate heat, but they generated hope, which could be equally vital for survival. The concept of mental toughness took on literal survival importance in these conditions. Knights who could maintain calm, focused mental states were better able to manage their breathing, conserve energy, and make rational decisions about positioning and resource management. Those who succumbed to panic, despair, or anxiety often made poor choices that worsened their physical conditions and reduced their chances of surviving until dawn. Group mental strategies emerged from shared misery and mutual support. Knights developed informal traditions of quiet conversation, storytelling, or shared recitation that could help entire groups maintain morale during the worst conditions. These weren't loud social gatherings, they were subtle whispered communications designed to provide psychological support without disrupting the thermal arrangements everyone was struggling to maintain. The role of acceptance was crucial in medieval survival psychology. Knights learned to acknowledge their discomfort without fighting it, understanding that resistance and frustration only increase suffering without improving circumstances. This wasn't resignation. This was tactical submission to unavoidable circumstances while maintaining readiness to act when opportunities for improvement arose. Different personality types developed different mental survival strategies. Some knights became almost meditation-like in their approach, achieving states of calm detachment that helped them endure physical hardship with minimal psychological distress. Others maintained their mental strength through anger and defiance, using rage against their circumstances as fuel for survival determination. Both approaches could be effective depending on individual temperament and circumstances. The morning mental recovery was as important as the physical warming process. Knights who'd spent hours using psychological techniques to survive the night needed time to transition back to normal awareness and responsiveness. Some required periods of gradual mental engagement before they could assume their daily duties effectively. This psychological recovery time was generally understood and accommodated in castle routines. Historians still argue whether the mental techniques used by medieval knights were sophisticated psychological strategies or simply the natural human responses to extreme stress and discomfort. What's clear from personal accounts is that knights who survived multiple harsh winters often developed consistent mental approaches that helped them endure conditions that broke less experienced or less mentally prepared men. The moment when early dawn light begins seeping through shutters and window cracks doesn't bring relief. It brings the terrifying morning assessment, where you have to determine whether you've made it through the night with all your body parts still functional. This isn't about feeling groggy or stiff from sleeping on straw. This is about conducting a methodical inventory to discover if any parts of your body have suffered serious cold damage that could affect your ability to fight, work, or even survive the coming day. You start with your extremities because that's where frostbite strikes first and most severely. Fingers and toes are the canaries in the coal mine of hypothermic damage. You wiggle them carefully, testing for sensation movement and pain response. Normal morning stiffness from cold is one thing. Complete numbness or the sensation of wooden blocks where your fingers used to be is something entirely different and potentially catastrophic for a knight whose life depends on sword work and equipment handling. The colour assessment comes next, and this is where medieval knights learn to be their own medical diagnosticians. Healthy cold skin should be pale or slightly bluish, but should rapidly return to normal colour when pressed and released. Skin that remains white when pressed turns grey or black, or shows no colour. Response at all indicates serious frostbite that requires immediate attention. Knights learn to recognise the difference between temporary cold damage and permanent injury that could end military careers. Circulation restoration becomes a careful, systematic process that requires patience and technique. The temptation is to warm damaged extremities as quickly as possible, but knights learned through painful experience that rapid rewarming of frostbitten tissue could cause additional damage. Instead, they developed gradual warming protocols, gentle massage, gradual exposure to heat sources, and slow movement exercises designed to restore blood flow without causing tissue damage. Here's where the buddy system becomes crucial. You can't properly assess your own back, examine areas you can't see clearly, or provide effective treatment for your own severe cold injuries. Knights learn to conduct mutual morning assessments, checking each other for signs of serious cold damage that the affected person might not be able to detect themselves. This wasn't just medical care. It was tactical necessity, since undetected cold injuries could compromise combat effectiveness and endanger entire units. The pain evaluation requires understanding the difference between good pain and bad pain in cold-damaged tissue. The burning, tingling sensation of circulation returning to moderately cold-affected areas is normal and actually indicates successful recovery. But sharp stabbing pain or complete absence of pain in areas that should be sensitive can indicate serious nerve or tissue damage that requires more aggressive treatment or even medical evacuation from active duty. Movement testing reveals the functional impact of night-long cold exposure. Knights needed to assess not just whether their fingers and toes were intact, but whether they retained the fine motor control necessary for weapon handling, armor management, and equipment operation. A knight who couldn't properly grip his sword or manipulate his shield straps was a liability to himself and his unit, regardless of his courage or training. The warming protocols varied depending on the severity of cold damage discovered during morning assessment. Minor cold effect could be treated with gradual exercise, shared body heat, and proximity to fires. More serious conditions required aggressive warming techniques, immersion in heated water, application of heated stones, or even sharing cloaks, and direct skin contact with warmer companions to restore core body temperature. Different castle garrisons developed standardized morning assessment procedures that balanced individual care with military efficiency. Some implemented formal buddy check systems where knights were assigned specific partners for mutual cold damage evaluation. Others relied on experienced sergeants or medical personnel to conduct group assessments and identify knights who needed additional recovery time before assuming duties. The reporting protocols for serious cold injuries created tension between individual survival needs and military requirements. Knights who reported severe frostbite or hypothermia symptoms might be removed from active duty until they recovered, but they also risked being seen as weak or unreliable. Some chose to hide serious cold damage rather than face potential social or professional consequences, sometimes worsening their injuries through neglect. The long-term impact assessment was crucial for career planning and military effectiveness. Knights who suffered repeated serious cold injuries often developed chronic circulation problems, reduced sensitivity in extremities, or permanent mobility limitations that affected their combat capabilities. Understanding these progressive effects helped inform decisions about duty assignments, retirement planning, and training modifications. Regional variations in morning assessment reflected local climate challenges and medical knowledge. Northern European castles developed more sophisticated cold injury evaluation techniques because they dealt with more severe and frequent cases. Areas with milder climates might have less systematic approaches, but also face different challenges when unexpected, severe weather caught garrisons unprepared for serious cold management. Historians still argue whether the morning assessment protocols described in surviving accounts were formal military procedures or informal survival practices that developed organically among experienced knights. What's clear is that knights who survived multiple harsh winters consistently demonstrated systematic approaches to evaluating and treating cold-related injuries that suggest shared knowledge and established practices. If you think sleeping in a castle barracks was rough, imagine trying to get rest while lying on frozen ground with nothing between you and the earth but a thin cloak surrounded by the sounds of enemy movement in the darkness, where a wrong decision about warmth versus concealment could mean waking up dead from hypothermia or from an enemy blade finding you in your sleep. Campaign sleeping was survival on an entirely different level from castle comfort. Out in the field, knights lost access to every single advantage they'd relied on in their stone fortresses. No hearths, no braziers, no heated stones, no dogs, and definitely no straw mattresses crawling with merely domestic fleas. Instead, you'd find yourself in situations where the ground itself was your enemy, sucking heat from your body with the relentless efficiency of a thermal vampire that never got tired and never showed mercy. The ground preparation became a crucial skill that separated veteran campaign knights from those who wouldn't survive their first winter deployment. You couldn't just throw your cloak down and hope for the best. Smart knights learned to scrape away snow and ice, then create insulating layers, using whatever organic material was available. Pine needles, dried leaves, grass, moss, or even their own equipment arranged to create barriers between their bodies and the heat-stealing earth. Here's where campaign sleeping gets tactically complex. You needed to balance warmth with concealment and security. A fire could save your life by providing heat, but it could also attract enemy attention and get you killed by arrow or blade. Knights learned to create ghost fires, tiny smokeless heating sources hidden in depressions or behind natural windbreaks that provided just enough warmth to prevent death without advertising their position to hostile forces. The group sleeping arrangements on campaign were even more intimate and desperate than castle barrack situations. Knights would literally pile together under shared cloaks and blankets, creating human heat clusters that resembled more of a survival huddle than a military sleeping arrangement. Privacy became a luxury that could literally kill you, and personal space was measured in inches rather than feet. These weren't comfortable social arrangements. These were life-or-death thermal cooperation agreements. Equipment management during campaign sleeping required constant strategic thinking. Your armor, weapons, and gear couldn't be stored safely away. Like in a castle, they had to remain accessible for instant use, while also being protected from weather damage that could compromise their effectiveness. Knights learned to sleep partially armed, keeping critical equipment close enough to grab instantly, while using some pieces as additional insulation or ground barriers. The weather monitoring skills that knights developed during campaigns were remarkably sophisticated. They learned to read cloud patterns, wind changes, and temperature drops that could indicate incoming storms or severe cold fronts. This knowledge was literally life-saving because being caught unprepared by sudden weather changes while sleeping exposed in the field could wipe out entire units through hypothermia or frostbite. Different campaign conditions required different survival strategies. Mountain campaigns meant dealing with altitude effects that made cold more dangerous and recovery more difficult. Forest deployments offered more natural insulation materials but also more concealment challenges. Open plains provided better visibility for security, but offered no natural windbreaks or shelter materials. Knights had to adapt their sleeping strategies constantly based on terrain and tactical situations. The supply considerations for campaign sleeping were always desperate compromises. Every piece of equipment for warmth, extra blankets, portable braziers, additional fuel meant less space for food weapons or medical supplies. Campaign commanders had to make brutal calculations about how much comfort equipment to carry versus how much military effectiveness to maintain. Too much warmth gear meant a slow, vulnerable force. Too little meant dead knights who couldn't fight at all. Emergency protocols for severe weather during campaigns could involve extreme measures that would never be considered in castle settings. Knights might be ordered to kill horses for their body heat and hide construct emergency shelters from available materials, or even retreat into enemy territory to find better shelter, rather than risk losing entire units to weather. These decisions required commanders who understood that strategic retreat could be more important than tactical position when survival was at stake. The psychological challenges of campaign sleeping were immense compared to castle conditions. The constant awareness of vulnerability, the sounds of potential threats in the darkness, and the knowledge that rescue wasn't available if things went wrong, created mental stress that made physical discomfort even harder to endure. Knights had to maintain alertness for security threats, while also trying to achieve the rest necessary for combat effectiveness. Regional campaign strategies reflected local climate knowledge and traditional survival techniques. Scandinavian knights developed snow shelter construction methods that could provide surprising warmth and concealment. Alpine fighters learned to identify and utilize natural thermal features like rock formations that retained heat or natural windbreaks that could provide shelter. Desert campaign veterans understood how to use daytime heat retention for nighttime warmth in environments where temperatures dropped dramatically after sunset. Historians still argue whether campaign sleeping conditions were the primary factor limiting medieval military campaigns during winter months, or whether strategic and supply considerations were more important. What's clear from surviving campaign records is that weather-related casualties often exceeded combat casualties during winter deployments, and that successful commanders placed enormous emphasis on cold weather survival training and equipment. The influence of monastic sleeping practices on military barracks wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate adoption of survival techniques that monks had perfected through centuries of surviving harsh winters while maintaining their religious duties. Knights didn't just borrow random ideas from monasteries. They systematically studied and adapted religious communities' approaches to cold weather survival, because monks had figured out how to stay alive and functional in conditions that were often even more austere than military barracks. Monastic sleep schedules were originally designed around prayer obligations, but they accidentally created thermal management systems that knights found remarkably effective for cold survival. The practice of sleeping in segments, going to bed early, waking for midnight prayers, then returning to sleep until dawn, actually worked better for cold weather survival than trying to sleep through entire frigid nights. During the midnight wake period, monks would move around, restore circulation, tend fires, and warm themselves before returning to sleep with better blood flow and higher core temperatures. The communal dormitory arrangements that monks used for spiritual discipline became models for military thermal efficiency. Monastic communities had learned that rows of sleeping monks generated collective body heat more effectively than individual cells, and that shared spaces could be heated more efficiently than private rooms. Knights adopted these spatial arrangements not for religious reasons, but because they worked for survival in unheated stone buildings. Prayer schedules accidentally created ideal warming intervals that prevented the deep hypothermia that could occur during long, uninterrupted sleep in freezing conditions. When monks woke for matins in the middle of the night, they were forced to move their bodies, restore circulation, and engage in physical activity that generated heat and prevented the dangerous deep cooling that could occur during extended periods of inactivity. Knights began incorporating similar scheduled wake periods into their own sleep routines. The monastic approach to clothing and bedding provided practical models for military adaptation. Monks had developed systems of layered woolen robes that could be adjusted for different temperature conditions, while maintaining the mobility necessary for religious duties. Their bedding arrangements used simple materials, straw, wool blankets, basic pillows, but arranged them according to principles that maximized warmth retention while allowing for the quick rising required by religious schedules. Here's where the spiritual and practical intersected in interesting ways. Monastic communities had developed group warming activities that served both religious and thermal purposes. Communal prayers, group movements, and shared activities created opportunities for collective heat generation, while maintaining the discipline and order necessary for military units. Knights found that these practices could be adapted to create warming routines that boosted both morale and physical comfort. The monastic emphasis on endurance and acceptance of discomfort provided psychological models that knights found valuable for cold weather survival. Monks had developed mental techniques for enduring physical hardship as part of their spiritual discipline, and these same techniques proved effective for knights who needed to maintain psychological strength during harsh winter conditions. The religious framework provided meaning and purpose that could help soldiers endure otherwise unbearable circumstances. Different monastic orders offered different survival strategies that appealed to various military situations. Benedictine communities emphasized routine and systematic approaches to cold management that worked well for stable garrison situations. Cistercian practices focused on simplicity and efficiency that suited campaign conditions where resources were limited. Some military units even adopted specific monastic rules that had proven effective for winter survival in their geographic regions. The architectural lessons from monastery design influenced military barracks construction and modification. Monastic communities had learned through experience how to arrange sleeping spaces, heating systems, and airflow patterns to maximize warmth while accommodating large numbers of people. Castle commanders studied these arrangements and adapted them to military needs, sometimes literally hiring monastery-trained builders to modify their barracks. Medical knowledge from monastic communities provided knights with practical information about treating cold-related injuries and illnesses. Monasteries often served as medieval medical centres, and monks had accumulated extensive experience treating frostbite, hypothermia, and winter-related health problems. This knowledge was systematically shared with military units through chaplains and other religious personnel who served in castle garrisons. The food and drink traditions from monastic communities offered models for nutrition strategies that supported cold weather survival. Monks had developed recipes and preparation methods for foods that provided maximum warming and nutritional benefits using limited ingredients and fuel resources. Knights adopted many of these practices, particularly the preparation of warming drinks and high-calorie foods that could sustain energy production during cold conditions. Timing and schedule adaptations from monastic practice helped knights optimize their daily routines for cold weather effectiveness. Religious communities had learned how to coordinate sleeping, eating, working, and warming activities to maintain health and functionality during harsh winters. Military units found that similar scheduling approaches could improve both individual survival and unit effectiveness during cold weather operations. Regional variations in monastic influence reflected local religious traditions and climate challenges. Northern European monasteries had developed particularly sophisticated cold survival techniques that influenced military practices in those regions. Mediterranean monastic communities offered different strategies that worked better in milder but still challenging winter conditions. Some military units even maintained formal relationships with nearby monasteries to share knowledge and resources during particularly harsh winters. Historians still argue whether the adoption of monastic practices by military units was widespread or limited to specific regions and time periods. What's clear from surviving records is that successful military commanders consistently sought practical knowledge from any available source, and that monastic communities represented some of the most experienced and successful practitioners of cold weather survival in medieval society. The process of conditioning your body for winter barracks survival didn't begin when the first frost appeared. It started in late summer, when experienced knights began systematically preparing their physiology for the months of thermal torture ahead. This wasn't just about gathering warmer clothing or stockpiling fuel. This was about gradually training your body to function and survive in conditions that could kill an unprepared person within hours. The conditioning process began with controlled exposure to progressively cooler temperatures during autumn months. Knights would deliberately spend time in unheated areas of the castle, sleep with fewer blankets than comfortable, and expose themselves to cold air in measured doses that gradually expanded their tolerance for thermal stress. This wasn't masochism. This was systematic desensitization training that could mean the difference between surviving winter or becoming a cautionary tale. Dietary modifications during autumn served both nutritional and physiological preparation purposes. Knights learned to increase their consumption of fats and proteins that would provide better fuel for internal heat generation during winter months. They would also begin consuming more of the warming spices and herbs that would become essential for winter survival: ginger, garlic, cinnamon, and other ingredients that improve circulation and internal heat production. Physical conditioning took on specific focus areas that directly related to cold weather survival. Knights emphasized exercises that improved circulation to extremities, developed core body strength for heat generation, and practiced breathing techniques that would become crucial during winter nights. Sword work and combat training continued, but with added emphasis on maintaining dexterity and coordination in cold conditions that could compromise fine motor control. The gradual clothing transition was as important as physical conditioning. Knights didn't suddenly switch from summer garments to full winter gear. They systematically added layers and heavier materials as temperatures dropped, allowing their bodies to adapt to the weight mobility restrictions and thermal properties of cold weather equipment. This gradual adaptation prevented the shock of sudden environmental changes that could compromise both comfort and combat effectiveness. Sleep schedule modifications began weeks before the truly cold weather arrived. Knights started practicing the segmented sleep patterns that would become necessary during winter months when continuous sleep in freezing conditions was dangerous. They learned to wake naturally during night hours, perform warming activities, and return to sleep, training their bodies for the sleep patterns that would keep them alive during the harshest months. Here's where the preparation gets psychologically sophisticated. Knights began developing the mental habits and emotional frameworks that would sustain them through months of physical discomfort and survival stress. They practiced meditation techniques, strengthened social bonds with sleeping partners, and established personal rituals that would provide psychological anchors during the darkest, coldest periods of winter. Equipment preparation was equally systematic, with knights gradually testing and modifying their cold weather gear during progressively harsher conditions. They learned how their personal equipment performed in different temperature ranges, identified weaknesses in their survival systems, and made modifications while they still had access to materials and craftsmen who could improve their gear before winter made such improvements impossible. Social preparation involved establishing the relationships and agreements that would become crucial for group survival during winter months. Knights negotiated sleeping arrangements, established sharing protocols for warmth resources, and developed the trust and cooperation that would be essential when survival depended on group coordination and mutual support. These weren't casual friendships. These were survival partnerships that required genuine commitment and reliability. Regional variations in conditioning reflected local climate patterns and traditional knowledge. Knights serving in northern regions began their preparation earlier and focused more intensively on extreme cold adaptation. Those in milder climates could start later, but still needed systematic preparation for the specific challenges of their local winter conditions. Coastal knights prepared for different challenges, humidity, wind, and temperature fluctuations that required different conditioning strategies. The role of experienced mentors was crucial in the conditioning process. Veteran knights who had survived multiple harsh winters provided guidance training and knowledge transfer that could save lives among newer garrison members. This mentorship wasn't just professional development, it was literally life or death education, where experienced survivors shared techniques and knowledge that couldn't be learned from books or formal training. Medical preparation included building up resistance to common winter illnesses and learning to recognize early signs of cold-related health problems. Knights worked with castle medical personnel to understand the symptoms of hypothermia, frostbite, and winter diseases that could compromise their effectiveness or threaten their survival. This knowledge was as important as weapons training for winter garrison duty. The timing of conditioning activities was carefully coordinated with castle schedules and military obligations. Preparation activities had to be balanced with regular duties, training requirements, and military readiness needs. Commanders who understood the importance of winter conditioning would adjust schedules and priorities to ensure their men had adequate time for the preparation that would keep them functional during cold weather operations. Historians still argue whether systematic winter conditioning was widespread among medieval military units, or whether most knights simply endured harsh conditions through willpower and luck. Archaeological and documentary evidence suggests that successful military units consistently invested time and resources in cold weather preparation, indicating that systematic conditioning was recognized as essential for maintaining effective fighting forces during winter months. When a knight showed signs of severe hypothermia, the deadly kind where consciousness becomes cloudy speech, turns to mumbling and coordination disappears entirely, the castle barracks transformed from a sleeping area into an emergency medical facility where quick aggressive action meant the difference between saving a comrade and preparing a body for burial in frozen ground that wouldn't accept graves until spring. The recognition protocols for severe hypothermia were knowledge that every experienced knight carried as survival insurance. Mild hypothermia was common and manageable, but severe hypothermia was a medical emergency that required immediate intervention. Knights learned to identify the progression. First came violent shivering that the victim couldn't control, then paradoxical undressing, where hypothermic people would remove clothing because their confused brains interpreted the cold as heat, and finally the deadly quiet stage where shivering stopped because the body no longer had energy to generate heat. The immediate response was systematic and aggressive. The affected knight had to be moved to the warmest available location, usually as close to a fire or brazier as possible without risking burns. But here's where medieval emergency medicine gets counterintuitive. Rapid rewarming could actually kill a severely hypothermic person by causing dangerous changes in heart rhythm or blood circulation. Knights learned to rewarm gradually using controlled heat application, rather than throwing someone directly onto a fire. Body heat sharing became an emergency medical procedure that required multiple knights working in coordinated shifts. Severely hypothermic knights were stripped of wet or frozen clothing and placed between warm bodies skin-to-skin contact that transferred heat directly and efficiently. This wasn't casual cuddling. This was medical treatment that required several healthy knights to sacrifice their own comfort for hours at a time to keep a comrade alive. The breathing assistance techniques were crucial because severe hypothermia could compromise respiratory function. Knights learned to monitor their comrades' breathing patterns and provide assistance by warming inhaled air, breathing on the victim's face, covering their mouth and nose with warm hands, or even sharing breath mouth-to-mouth style to ensure that frigid air didn't further cool the victim's core temperature. Here's where the emergency protocols get technically sophisticated. Knights understood that extremities, hands, feet, arms, and legs should be rewarmed last, not first. Warming the extremities too quickly in a severely hypothermic person could cause a dangerous rush of cold blood back to the heart, potentially causing fatal heart rhythm problems. Instead, they focused on warming the core chest, abdomen, and back, allowing circulation to gradually restore heat to the extremities naturally. The liquid administration required careful judgment about what to give and when. Warm drinks could help restore core temperature, but only if the victim was conscious enough to swallow safely. Unconscious or semi-conscious hypothermic knights couldn't be given liquids because of choking risks. Instead, heat had to be applied externally through heated stones placed on major blood vessels, neck armpits and groin, where they could warm blood flowing to vital organs. Different levels of hypothermia required different intervention strategies. Mild cases could be treated with standard warming techniques: fires, warm drinks, shared body heat, and heated stones. Moderate hypothermia required more aggressive interventions and multiple helpers working in shifts. Severe hypothermia was a life-threatening emergency that required all available personnel and could take hours of intensive treatment before the victim was stable enough to be left alone. The monitoring process during rewarming was as important as the initial treatment. Knights learned to track their comrades' responsiveness, coordination, speech clarity, and colour changes that indicated whether the treatment was working or whether the victim was continuing to deteriorate. This required experienced judgment, because hypothermia recovery wasn't always linear. Victims could seem to improve and then suddenly worsen if the treatment wasn't sustained properly. Emergency fuel allocation became a life-or-death resource management issue. Treating severe hypothermia required massive amounts of heat energy, keeping fires burning continuously, heating multiple stones, warming large quantities of water or other liquids. This fuel consumption could deplete the garrison's heating resources for days, requiring commanders to make difficult decisions about resource allocation when every piece of fuel was precious for general survival. The recovery timeline for severe hypothermia was measured in hours, not minutes. Knights learned that successful rewarming was a slow process that required sustained effort and careful monitoring. Victims might remain confused, weak, or uncoordinated for hours after their core temperature was restored, and they remained vulnerable to renewed hypothermia if they weren't kept warm and monitored carefully. Different castle garrisons developed specialized equipment for hypothermia emergencies. Some maintained dedicated medical supplies, extra blankets, rapid heating devices warming liquids specifically for cold weather medical crises. Others designated specific knights as cold weather medical specialists who received additional training in hypothermia, recognition and treatment techniques. Prevention protocols were considered as important as treatment procedures. Knights learned to monitor each other for early signs of hypothermia progression, understanding that intervention during mild stages was far more effective than waiting until severe symptoms developed. Buddy systems and regular check-ins during extremely cold periods helped identify problems before they became life-threatening emergencies. Regional variations in emergency warming techniques reflected local medical knowledge and climate challenges. Northern European castles developed particularly sophisticated hypothermia treatment protocols because they faced more frequent and severe cases. Areas with access to hot springs or other natural heating sources incorporated these resources into their emergency medical procedures. Historians still argue whether the emergency warming protocols described in surviving accounts represent formal medical knowledge or practical techniques developed through trial and error by experienced military units. What's clear is that garrisons with systematic approaches to hypothermia emergencies had significantly better survival rates during harsh winters than those that relied on improvised responses to medical crises. The bonds forged between knights who survived winter after winter in those freezing stone chambers weren't just friendships, they were survival partnerships sealed by shared misery, mutual dependence, and the intimate knowledge that your life literally depended on the man shivering next to you. These relationships transcended normal military hierarchy and social boundaries, because when you're both fighting hypothermia at 3 a.m. rank becomes less important than reliable body heat and unquestioning loyalty. Picture yourself sharing a flea-infested mattress with the same 3 knights for months on end, your survival depending on their willingness to share warmth-heated stones and precious blankets when the temperature drops below what human bodies can endure alone. You learn everything about these men, their breathing patterns, their sleep movements, their tolerance for cold, their personal warming techniques. More importantly, you learn whether they'll choose self-preservation or group survival when resources are scarce, and choices become matters of life and death. The trust that developed wasn't the casual confidence you might place in a training partner or drinking companion. This was existential trust where betrayal meant potential death. Knights who shared winter barracks learned to coordinate their movements without words, share resources without negotiation, and provide mutual support without being asked. A knight who rolled over carelessly and disrupted everyone's thermal arrangements, or who hoarded heated stones while companions suffered quickly, found himself isolated in ways that could prove fatal. Combat effectiveness was directly enhanced by these survival partnerships. Knights who had learned to anticipate each other's needs, coordinate their movements in confined spaces, and maintain group cohesion under extreme stress, translated these skills directly to battlefield situations. The man who had shared his cloak during a brutal January night was someone you could trust to guard your flank during combat, because he'd already demonstrated that your survival mattered as much as his own. The social levelling effect of shared survival was remarkable, and sometimes revolutionary within military hierarchies. A noble-born knight who couldn't generate adequate body heat might find himself dependent on a common-born soldier who had superior cold-weather survival skills. Rank still mattered for formal military purposes, but thermal competence and survival reliability created alternative status systems where practical skills could override social position. Here's where the Brotherhood gets psychologically complex. Knights developed intimate knowledge of each other's vulnerabilities, fears and survival limits. They knew who panicked in extreme cold, who hoarded resources when scared, who could be counted on during emergencies, and who might crack under sustained thermal stress. This knowledge created powerful bonds of mutual protection, but also potential leverage that could be used for manipulation or control. The shared sacrifice aspects of winter survival created obligations and loyalties that extended far beyond individual castle assignments. Knights who had saved each other's lives through shared warmth. Emergency rewarming or resource sharing often maintained these relationships throughout their military careers. A knight might request specific transfers to serve with men who had proven reliable during harsh winter conditions, viewing these partnerships as essential for future survival and success. Different personality types contributed different strengths to survival groups. Some knights were natural heat generators who provided disproportionate warming benefits to their sleeping partners. Others were skilled resource managers who could make fuel and blankets stretch further than seemed possible. Some excelled at morale maintenance, keeping spirits up during the darkest, coldest periods, when despair became as dangerous as hypothermia. The conflict resolution skills that developed from forced intimacy under extreme conditions were remarkably sophisticated. Knights living in survival-dependent proximity couldn't afford the luxury of extended feuds or grudges that might compromise group warming effectiveness. They learned to negotiate quickly, forgive readily and subordinate personal conflicts to collective survival needs. These skills proved valuable in military units where group cohesion was essential for combat effectiveness. Mentorship relationships often developed along thermal competence lines rather than traditional military ranking. Veteran knights who had mastered cold weather survival techniques became informal teachers for newer garrison members, passing along knowledge that couldn't be learned from formal training. These mentorships created loyalty bonds that could last entire careers, with survival knowledge being traded for service protection and future support. The women who occasionally entered these survival arrangements, whether as camp followers, servants, or in rare cases female warriors, often became crucial thermal resources who commanded respect and protection far beyond their formal military status. A woman who could effectively share body heat, manage warming resources, or provide medical care during hypothermia emergencies became a valuable member of survival groups regardless of traditional gender roles or social expectations. Memory and storytelling traditions preserved the legends of exceptional survival partnerships and group achievements. Knights developed oral traditions celebrating particularly successful winter survival groups, memorable rescue efforts, and examples of extraordinary loyalty and sacrifice during harsh conditions. These stories served both entertainment and educational purposes, transmitting survival knowledge while reinforcing values of mutual dependence and group loyalty. Regional variations in Brotherhood traditions reflected local climate challenges and cultural values. Scandinavian and Northern European Knight Brotherhoods emphasized extreme weather survival skills and group dependence. Mediterranean regions developed different bonding traditions around shared hardships that were less focused on thermal survival, but equally important for unit cohesion. Historians still argue whether the intense relationships formed in medieval winter barracks represented genuine emotional bonds or simply practical survival arrangements. What's clear from personal accounts and letters is that knights consistently maintain these relationships long after their original survival circumstances ended, suggesting that shared suffering created connections that transcended mere convenience or necessity. As consciousness finally begins to fade and your exhausted body surrenders to sleep despite the cold that has been your constant enemy, throughout the night you enter a realm where the mind creates its own warmth, a place where dreams become refuges more precious than any physical fire, and where the sleeping brain constructs elaborate fantasies of heat, comfort and safety that provide psychological survival when physical endurance reaches its limits. Your dreams in these freezing chambers aren't the random neural firing of a comfortable sleeper. They're survival mechanisms crafted by a mind desperate for relief from relentless cold stress. You find yourself dreaming of summer battlefields where the weight of armor creates welcome heat instead of bone-deep chill, where the exertion of sword work floods your body with warming blood flow, where the sun beats down so intensely that you actually long for shade instead of desperately seeking any source of warmth. The dream landscapes your mind creates are thermally motivated in ways that reveal how profoundly the cold has shaped your consciousness. You dream of working in forge heat, standing so close to roaring fires that your face burns with radiant warmth. You dream of harvest time when heavy labour under hot sun left you drenched in sweat that seemed like luxury compared to the perpetual chill that defines your waking hours. You dream of childhood kitchens where massive hearths created zones of impossible comfort that your sleeping mind reconstructs with vivid, desperate detail. But here's where the psychology of extreme survival creates fascinating contradictions. Sometimes your dreams become so powerfully warm and comfortable that waking up feels like dying. The transition from dream warmth to chamber cold is so brutal that some nights learn to fight against consciousness, trying to remain in sleep where psychological warmth was possible. The contrast between dream comfort and physical reality could be so severe that it actually increased suffering rather than providing relief. The shared dreaming experiences create an unspoken bond among sleeping knights. In the morning, conversations would sometimes reveal that multiple men had dreamed of similar warm environments. Southern campaigns, harvest celebrations, forge work, or family hearths. These parallel dreams weren't coincidence. They were evidence of how profoundly the shared survival stress shaped not just physical responses, but psychological ones, creating common mental refuges that served as collective survival mechanisms. Your sleeping brain constructs detailed sensory experiences of warmth that feel completely real. The sensation of hot soup sliding down your throat, the feeling of warm wool against clean skin, the pleasure of stretching muscles that aren't clenched against cold. These dream sensations are so vivid that nights would sometimes wake believing they had actually eaten warm food or felt genuine heat, only to discover that their bodies were still locked in the same thermal survival struggle they'd been fighting when they fell asleep. The nightmare aspects of winter survival dreams reveal the psychological toll of sustained cold stress. Nights would dream of freezing to death, of finding their companions frozen solid, of fires going out and never being relit. But even these anxiety dreams serve survival functions by rehearsing emergency scenarios and keeping survival vigilance active even during sleep. The sleeping mind practiced survival strategies, problem-solved thermal challenges, and maintained alertness for dangers that could kill during vulnerable sleeping hours. Home dreams became particularly powerful and emotionally complex for nights serving far from their birthplaces, dreams of childhood beds in warm family homes, of mothers cooking, and father's hearthside stories of summers that seemed impossible from the perspective of a frozen castle chamber. These dreams provided psychological connection to identity and purpose beyond mere survival, reminding sleeping nights of lives and relationships that gave meaning to their current suffering. The religious and spiritual dimensions of cold sleep dreams often reflected the medieval understanding of suffering as potentially redemptive. Knights would dream of saints who had endured cold suffering of religious imagery, associated with endurance and faith of divine warmth that transcended physical temperature. These dreams provided frameworks for understanding their hardship as meaningful, rather than simply brutal, connecting their survival struggle to larger spiritual purposes. Memory integration during cold sleep created interesting phenomena where survival techniques learned during waking hours became incorporated into dream scenarios. Knights would dream of executing perfect cloak wrapping techniques, of successfully maintaining fires through impossible conditions, of sharing warmth with perfect efficiency. These dreams served as mental rehearsal that reinforced survival skills and built confidence for future thermal challenges. The transition from sleep to consciousness in medieval winter barracks required its own psychological strategies. Knights learned to ease themselves gradually from dream warmth to physical reality, using the memory of dream comfort to cushion the shock of waking cold. Some developed personal rituals that honored their dreams while preparing for the physical challenges of the waking world, brief mental acknowledgements of dream warmth before facing the day's thermal reality. Different knights developed different dream patterns based on their individual psychological responses to cold stress. Some became elaborate fantasy constructors who created detailed warm worlds they could return to night after night. Others found relief in simple, repetitive, warm imagery, single fires, single hot meals, single moments of comfort replayed endlessly. Both approaches served survival functions by providing psychological relief from conditions that could break mental resilience as easily as they threatened physical survival. The cultural memory aspects of survival. Dreams connected individual knights to broader human traditions of endurance and hope. Dreams of legendary warm places, the Holy Land, Mediterranean shores, distant kingdoms where winter never came provided connection to shared cultural knowledge and aspirations that transcended immediate survival circumstances. These dreams reminded sleeping knights that warmth existed somewhere in the world, even if it seemed impossible from their current perspective. Hidden throughout medieval castles were architectural secrets that most inhabitants never discovered, concealed warming chambers and thermal refuges that castle builders designed specifically for the worst winter emergency spaces that could mean the difference between a garrison surviving a brutal siege or being found frozen in their beds when spring finally arrived. These weren't luxury accommodations. They were last resort survival bunkers where human life could be preserved when the main castle heating systems failed completely. The underground warming chambers were perhaps the most sophisticated of these hidden thermal refuges. Located beneath the main living areas, often carved directly into bedrock, these spaces took advantage of Earth's natural insulation and thermal mass to maintain temperatures that were survivable even when surface areas became uninhabitable. Some were connected to kitchen areas through concealed passages, allowing emergency access to cooking fires and food supplies during extreme weather events that made normal movement through the castle impossible. Castle builders incorporated thermal alcoves into wall construction, small chambers within the thickness of stone walls that could be heated with portable braziers and sealed with heavy curtains or wooden doors. These alcoves were sized to accommodate 2 to 4 people in extreme proximity, creating microenvironments where body heat and minimal fuel could maintain life-supporting temperatures. Knights who knew about these features could retreat to them during the worst cold snaps, essentially hibernating until conditions improved. Here's where medieval engineering gets genuinely clever. Some castles featured interconnected warming tunnels that linked different parts of the fortress through underground passages that maintained higher temperatures than surface corridors. These tunnels weren't just transportation routes, they were thermal lifelines that allowed people to move between heated areas without exposure to killing cold. During extreme weather, entire garrisons could retreat into these tunnel systems and survive conditions that would be fatal in the main castle chambers. The concealment of these warming features served multiple strategic purposes beyond simple comfort. Enemy forces besieging a castle during winter wouldn't know about hidden thermal refuges giving defenders advantages in siege warfare where cold could be as dangerous as weapons. Attackers might assume a castle was uninhabitable during harsh winter conditions, not realizing that defenders had access to hidden warming systems that could sustain resistance indefinitely. Secret fuel storage areas were often connected to these hidden warming chambers, containing emergency supplies of charcoal-dried wood and heating materials that were reserved specifically for life-threatening cold emergencies. These stockpiles were sometimes walled up behind false panels or hidden in chambers that could only be accessed through concealed entrances, ensuring that emergency heating resources couldn't be discovered and depleted during normal winter operations. The ventilation systems for these hidden warming spaces were engineering marvels that balance air circulation with heat retention. Concealed chimney systems carried smoke away from underground chambers without revealing their locations to outside observers. Air shafts provided oxygen while minimizing heat loss using curved or baffled designs that prevented cold air from pouring directly into warming spaces. Some systems even incorporated heat exchangers, where outgoing warm air helped heat incoming fresh air. Different castle designs featured different types of thermal refuges based on regional climate challenges and local building traditions. Northern European fortresses often included extensive underground warming complexes with multiple connected chambers and sophisticated heating systems. Mountain castles featured refuges carved into natural rock formations that provided superior insulation and thermal mass. Coastal fortresses developed systems that dealt with humidity and salt air while still providing emergency thermal protection. The access protocols for these secret warming chambers were closely guarded, knowledge passed down through castle families and trusted military personnel. Not everyone in a garrison would know about all the thermal refuges available, and access rights were often restricted to senior personnel or reserved for genuine emergencies. Some castles maintained written records of these features in encoded documents that could only be interpreted by authorized individuals. Emergency provisioning for hidden warming chambers included more than just heating fuel. These spaces often contained emergency food supplies, medical materials and basic survival equipment that could sustain small groups during extended periods when normal castle operations became impossible. Water sources were particularly crucial, since frozen water supplies could force people out of otherwise effective thermal refuges. The social dynamics of hidden warming chambers created interesting hierarchies and relationships during extreme cold emergencies. Access to these refuges could determine who lived and who died during the worst weather, creating power structures based on knowledge and authority rather than just military rank. Some castle inhabitants spent entire careers without learning about thermal refuges that existed within steps of their normal living areas. Maintenance of concealed warming systems required specialized knowledge and ongoing attention that most castle inhabitants never saw. Hidden passages needed to be kept clear, ventilation systems required cleaning, fuel supplies had to be rotated and replenished, and heating equipment needed regular inspection and repair. This maintenance was often performed by trusted servants or specialized personnel who understood the life-saving importance of keeping these systems functional. The historical records of these hidden warming features are incomplete because their concealed nature meant they were rarely documented in ways that survived to modern times. Many castle ruins likely contain thermal refuges that haven't been discovered by archaeologists, and the architectural knowledge for building these systems was often passed down through craft traditions rather than written documents. Regional variations in hidden warming chamber design reflected local climate challenges and building materials. Scandinavian castles featured particularly sophisticated underground thermal systems because surface winters could be genuinely lethal. Mediterranean fortresses had less elaborate hidden warming features, but still included emergency thermal refuges for unexpected severe weather. Some coastal regions developed systems that incorporated geothermal features or natural thermal springs into their hidden warming networks. Historians still argue whether these hidden thermal features were widespread throughout medieval castles or limited to particularly well-designed or wealthy fortifications. Archaeological evidence suggests that many castles included some form of concealed emergency heating arrangements, but the extent and sophistication of these systems varied dramatically based on local conditions and available resources. The brutal mathematics of winter fuel management in medieval castles would make modern accountants weep. Imagine having to calculate not just comfort or convenience, but literally how many logs equaled how many lives, where every piece of wood burned carelessly in November could mean frozen corpses in February. Castle stewards developed accounting systems that were part inventory management, part strategic planning, and part life-or-death gambling with resources that determined who would survive until spring. Fuel rationing began in late autumn with systematic assessments of available heating materials weighed against projected winter duration and garrison population. Stewards counted logs, measured charcoal supplies, calculated straw reserves, and estimated dung availability with the precision of military campaign planning. These weren't approximate inventories, they were survival equations, where mathematical errors could result in mass casualties from hypothermia during the coldest months. The hierarchy of fuel allocation revealed castle social structures with deadly clarity. The lords' chambers received priority heating fuel, followed by essential military personnel, then skilled craftsmen whose survival was necessary for castle operations, and finally common soldiers and servants, who often had to survive on whatever remained. This wasn't just social privilege, it was strategic resource management where losing key personnel to cold could compromise the entire castle's effectiveness and survival. Here's where the economics get ruthlessly practical. Fuel theft became a capital offense during harsh winters, because stealing heating materials could directly cause other people's deaths. Castle legal systems developed specific punishments for fuel-related crimes with penalties ranging from loss of heating privileges to execution, depending on the severity of the theft and the scarcity of resources. Guards were assigned specifically to protect fuel supplies, understanding that these stockpiles were as valuable as weapons or food. The trading and bartering systems that developed around heating fuel created informal economies within castle walls. Soldiers would trade military duties for additional fuel allocations, servants exchanged labour for heating privileges, and craftsmen bartered their skills for access to warmer areas or extra burning materials. These arrangements had to be carefully managed to prevent fuel hoarding by individuals at the expense of group survival. Different types of fuel required different storage and allocation strategies. Dry hardwood provided the most heat per piece, but was expensive and limited. Charcoal burned clean and hot, but was costly to produce and transport. Peat and dry dung were abundant, but produced less heat and more smoke. Straw burned quickly, but was essential for bedding and animal feed. Castle stewards had to balance these different fuel types in complex calculations that maximized heating efficiency while preserving resources for other essential uses. Emergency fuel reserves were maintained in hidden locations throughout many castles, stockpiles that were sealed and guarded for use only during genuine survival crises. These emergency supplies were often sufficient to heat only the most essential areas of the castle, for limited periods representing last resort resources that could keep core personnel alive when all other heating materials were exhausted. Access to emergency reserves required authorization from the highest castle authorities and was often restricted to life-threatening situations. The psychological warfare aspects of fuel scarcity became tools of control and discipline within castle hierarchies. Threatening to reduce someone's fuel allocation was often more effective than traditional punishments because it directly threatened survival rather than just comfort. Conversely, granting additional heating resources served as powerful rewards that could motivate exceptional service or loyalty during the harsh winter months. Fuel conservation techniques were developed and taught throughout castle populations, with experienced personnel sharing knowledge about maximizing heat output from limited materials. These techniques included optimal fire-building methods, heat retention strategies and timing systems that stretched fuel supplies through careful management of burning schedules and heat distribution priorities. The seasonal procurement of heating fuel required year-round planning and enormous labour investments. Castle populations spent significant portions of summer and autumn gathering, cutting, splitting, and storing heating materials for winter use. These activities often involved entire communities working together to ensure adequate fuel supplies, with understanding that failure to gather sufficient materials could result in winter deaths. Regional variations in fuel economics reflected local climate challenges and available resources. Northern European castles required massive fuel stockpiles and developed sophisticated storage and distribution systems to manage heating resources through extended winter periods. Forest regions had access to abundant wood, but needed systems for processing and storing large quantities of timber. Areas with limited wood resources developed expertise in alternative fuel sources and conservation techniques. The impact of fuel scarcity on military effectiveness was always a critical consideration in castle planning. Soldiers who were cold and exhausted from fighting hypothermia were less effective in combat and more vulnerable to illness. Commanders had to balance fuel allocation between maintaining garrison warmth and preserving resources for potential siege situations where heating fuel might need to last for extended periods without resupply. Market manipulation and fuel speculation sometimes occurred during particularly harsh winters when external fuel sources became available through trade. Merchants might attempt to exploit castle fuel shortages by demanding excessive prices for heating materials, creating economic warfare that could be as dangerous as military sieges. Some castles developed long-term contracts with fuel suppliers to prevent such exploitation. The health implications of fuel scarcity extended beyond simple cold exposure. Inadequate heating led to increased illness, reduced immune system function, and higher mortality rates from diseases that thrived in cold, damp conditions. Castle medical personnel understood that maintaining adequate heating was as important as food supplies, for keeping populations healthy and functional throughout winter months. Innovation in fuel efficiency was driven by survival necessity, leading to developments in fireplace design, heat distribution systems, and fuel preparation techniques that maximize thermal output from limited resources. Some castles experimented with heat recovery systems, improved chimney designs, and alternative burning methods that extracted more warmth from the same amount of fuel material. Historians still argue whether fuel management was the primary limiting factor in medieval castle operations during winter months, or whether other resource constraints were equally important. What's clear from surviving accounts is that successful castle management required sophisticated understanding of fuel economics, and that failures in heating resource planning could have catastrophic consequences for entire populations. When a knight's body began showing the telltale signs of serious cold damage, blackened fingertips, skin that stayed white when pressed, or the dangerous confusion that accompanied severe hypothermia. Medieval castle healers deployed a combination of folk wisdom herbal medicine and desperate improvisation that was part legitimate medical knowledge and part hopeful superstition, all applied with the understanding that winter could kill as efficiently as any enemy blade. The diagnostic techniques for cold-related injuries were surprisingly sophisticated for their era. Experienced healers learned to assess circulation by checking skin color changes, testing sensation with gentle pinpricks, and evaluating mobility in affected areas. They understood that frostbite progressed through stages from superficial skin damage that could heal completely to deep tissue death that might require amputation. This knowledge was learned through bitter experience accumulated over generations of treating knights who had pushed their cold tolerance too far. Herbal treatments for hypothermia and frostbite drew from extensive medieval pharmacological knowledge that modern research has sometimes validated. Ginger preparations were used to stimulate circulation with healers, creating warming poultices and hot drinks that genuinely improved blood flow to extremities. Garlic was applied both internally and externally, based on accurate observations that it had warming and antiseptic properties that could prevent infection in cold, damaged tissue. Here's where medieval medicine gets both clever and dangerous. Healers developed rewarming techniques that balanced aggressive treatment with awareness that too rapid temperature changes could cause additional damage. They used graduated heat applications starting with body temperature treatments and slowly increasing intensity that parallels modern medical protocols for hypothermia treatment. However, they also employed some techniques that were genuinely harmful, like rubbing frozen skin or applying direct heat to severely frostbitten areas. The pain management strategies for cold injuries relied heavily on alcohol and opium-based preparations when available. Medieval healers understood that the rewarming process for seriously cold-damaged tissue was extremely painful, and they developed techniques for managing this pain while still allowing patients to remain conscious enough to participate in their treatment. Heated wine mixed with pain-relieving herbs was a common preparation that served both warming and analgesic functions. Sleep medicine in medieval practice recognized that cold-damaged individuals needed special sleeping arrangements to prevent further injury and promote healing. Healers would prescribe specific bedding arrangements, heating protocols, and monitoring schedules for knights recovering from severe cold exposure. These patients were often kept in the warmest available spaces and checked throughout the night to ensure they maintained adequate body temperature during vulnerable recovery periods. The preventive medicine approaches were often more effective than treatments for established cold injuries. Castle healers developed seasonal health routines that prepared personnel for cold weather challenges, dietary modifications to improve circulation, exercise regimens to enhance cold tolerance, and herbal supplements believed to strengthen the body's resistance to winter ailments. Some of these practices, like increased consumption of warming spices and high-fat foods, align with modern nutritional understanding. Different classes of cold-related illnesses require different treatment approaches. Superficial frostbite could be treated with gentle warming herbal preparations and protective dressings. Severe hypothermia required aggressive interventions, including heated stone applications, shared body heat, and careful monitoring of vital signs. Deep frostbite might require surgical intervention, primitive amputation techniques performed without modern anesthesia, or sterile conditions representing medical procedures that were often as dangerous as the original injury. The seasonal medical preparations reflected understanding that winter brought specific health challenges that required proactive intervention. Castle medical personnel would stockpile warming herbs, prepare concentrated food supplements for cold weather nutrition, and create emergency medical supplies specifically for treating hypothermia and frostbite cases that were inevitable during harsh winters. Folk remedies and traditional treatments were integrated with more formal medical knowledge in ways that sometimes proved remarkably effective. Honey was used for treating cold-damaged skin based on accurate observations about its antibacterial and healing properties. Various animal fats were applied as protective barriers against cold exposure, providing genuine protection for skin exposed to extreme temperatures. The social aspects of medieval sleep medicine revealed interesting hierarchies of care and resource allocation. Wealthy knights had access to specialized treatments, expensive imported herbs, and dedicated medical attention that could significantly improve their chances of recovering from serious cold injuries. Common soldiers often relied on folk remedies, shared medical knowledge, and mutual care arrangements that were less sophisticated but still sometimes effective. Regional variations in cold weather medical practices reflected local climate challenges and available medicinal resources. Northern European healers developed particularly sophisticated hypothermia treatments because they dealt with more frequent and severe cases. Mediterranean regions had less experience with extreme cold medicine, but contributed knowledge about circulation-improving herbs and warming preparations that proved valuable when adapted to harsher climates. The integration of religious and medical approaches to cold weather health created treatment systems that addressed both physical and psychological aspects of winter survival. Prayers, blessings, and spiritual rituals were combined with herbal treatments and physical care in ways that provided comfort and hope, along with whatever medical benefit the actual treatments might offer. Emergency medical protocols for severe cold weather events were developed by castle medical personnel who understood that harsh winters could create mass casualty situations requiring systematic responses. These protocols included triage systems for prioritizing treatment, resource allocation strategies for managing limited medical supplies, and coordination procedures for mobilizing entire castle populations to provide care during cold weather medical emergencies. The documentation of medical knowledge was often limited because much medieval medical practice was transmitted through apprenticeship and oral tradition rather than written records. However, surviving medical texts include substantial information about cold weather health management, suggesting that this knowledge was considered important enough to preserve in written form for future practitioners. Historians still argue whether medieval medical treatments for cold-related injuries were genuinely effective, or whether patient survival was primarily due to natural recovery and basic supportive care. Modern analysis of some traditional treatments suggests that medieval healers had developed techniques that were medically sound, while others were ineffective or potentially harmful, reflecting the mixed nature of pre-scientific medical knowledge. Now let the story settle around you like a warm cloak, these final fragments of medieval knowledge dissolving into the comfort of your own bed. You've travelled through centuries of human ingenuity, witnessed the quiet heroism of survival in impossible conditions, and learned how people found ways to endure when endurance seemed beyond human capability. The castles sleep now in moonlight, and memory their stones holding echoes of whispered prayers and shared warmth. The knights who once shivered in those chambers have long since found their rest, but their wisdom lives on the understanding that survival is both an art and a science, that warmth shared doubles, and that even in the darkest cold human beings find ways to care for one another. Close your eyes now, grateful for the simple miracle of central heating and soft blankets, but carrying with you the deeper warmth of knowing how much strength and tenderness lie within human hearts when winter puts them to the test. Sleep well and dream of spring,